Welcome to our session, Feminist Expression After Deleuze and Guattari. This is part of the session, Feminisms and the Posts, Reorientations, Rethinkings, and Responsibilities. This presentation is by Dr. Lisa Mazzei from the University of Oregon and Dr. Alicia Jackson from Appalachian State University, both in the US. In this theoretical paper, what we are doing is positioning expression as that which activates worldings. We consider how expression makes itself felt and the potential for new feminist imaginings in qualitative inquiry. This work is coming from our recent second edition, 10th anniversary writing of Thinking with Theory in Qualitative Research. That book will be out sometime in the year 2022. And we're giving this talk today based on some of the shifts that we have made in the book from epistemology to ontology, and also focusing really on how we are using language and writing and expression as feminist practice. So we want to begin with Elizabeth Grosz's work in Becoming Undone and what it means to think like a feminist. And in that book, she writes, thinking like a feminist is to think differently, innovatively, in terms that have never been developed before. It's about the generation of new thought, new concepts. It's more than just feminist critique, and it's more than the generation of new truths, but it's actually a new way of thinking. And to produce new thought, to produce that which has not been thought before. So to think like a feminist after Deleuze and Guattari is to invent new concepts that give us new ways of living with problems rather than simply creating solutions to those problems. Concepts, quote, enable us to surround ourselves with possibilities for being otherwise, end quote. And again, that's all Elizabeth Grosz's work. This gives us some entree into feminist expression and how we are using it in our thinking with theory. So if we are to think like a feminist, as Elizabeth Grosz says, and to create new concepts, new terms that have never been developed before, Dr. Mazzei and I created thinking with theory. That is our concept. But it's also a practice. It's a practice of inquiry in the field of qualitative inquiry. So concepts are practices that we perform, not on things, but on events. And as we have been working with thinking with theory over the last 10 years, and especially in writing the second edition over the last 18 months or so, is that we have seen that thinking with theory has emerged as our feminist concept in response to the conventional methods-driven approaches of humanist qualitative research. We believe that thinking with theory is a feminist practice that also responds to the problem of representational writing in qualitative inquiry. So we've invented thinking with theory, and over the years, we've continued to distance ourselves from writing as designating or corresponding to the real. And what we do in this second edition of Thinking with Theory is to position language as ontological expression. So we're using writing in this presentation and in our second edition of Thinking with Theory to move our work into ontology. And we do that by way of Deleuze and Guattari's theory of expression, language theory of expression. So if language is not representational, if it's not, if it doesn't correspond to the real, then what is it? So one way to consider language as expression is a language shift that we made in the second edition of Thinking with Theory. We made a shift from writing about interview data, and we instead are naming the women's accounts of their lives as performative. So we see expression as performative. We see the women's accounts as performative because rather than communicating and representing individual experience by a narrating subject, their accounts bring forth the very life which they speak. So their accounts are not things, they're not stories that reflect experience. Their accounts do things. They're force, and as force, they transform our relation to thought and how we consider what might be said about life. So we don't approach their performative accounts as real words, as language as representation, or even brute data that accurately correspond to individual aspects of true life. Rather, we position their accounts as expressions. They express assemblages in formation that speak life within specific social obligations, and they're endowed with powers of becoming. So in the second edition of Thinking with Theory, we focus intently on language as performative repetitions that open up to difference and engender the unthought. And we derive this from the fourth plateau of 1,000 Plateaus. That's titled Postulates of Linguistics. And in that plateau, Deleuze and Guattari reject the postulate that language's function is informative and communicative. They do this by taking up J.L. Austin's performative theory, that is specific statements that perform the action that they state, and they extend this into all of language. So this is how we come upon language as expression rather than communicative or informative. Deleuze and Guattari say that language is impersonal and it's pre-personal and it's without origin. And therefore it is never uttered by an I or even a we as people, but it expresses the collective. Any repetition of expression then will produce some variations. And what we say in our book is that these variations are the plugging in that we do. The Thinking with Theory is this enactment of plugging in, and it allows differences to emerge. So expression is difference. It is expressed by a collective, not a intentional human subject who is conscious of the words that are being uttered. But it allows differences to emerge because of this collective. Expression composes these emergent collectives and thoughts. So that's where they belong to the collective itself. An example of that is, as we were writing Thinking with Theory, we realized that this writing, the expression of writing, activated an us rather than the other way around. We were not intentional subjects doing this writing, rather it activated our thinking. It activated what ended up being expressed in the book. So in that way, it is this impersonal, pre-personal, without origin, and of this collective. When writing emerges as collective and ontological, we claim that it unleashes becomings and worldings. And this is something that we're going to talk about later in our presentation. Thought in motion, this expression keeps thought in motion. And that's how ontology is working. Thought was made by the writing. And through this collective relational enactment, through these ontologies, then we claim that these enactments of inquiry are made through senses and attunements. And we'll also talk about that later. So enactments of inquiry are departures from epistemology and method. In other words, things such as method, objects, and subjects and knowledge do not pre-exist inquiry ready to be represented. And this is how we connect this to expression again. Rather, enactments are constituted and entangled in particular conditions. These conditions are put under ontological scrutiny as expression. They emerge as temporary, heterogeneous assemblages, and they reorient the given to open up to the unthought, to what might be and to what is possible. In this way, ontological inquiry moves from a concern with how humans perceive and represent their world to positing how everything is in and of the world. In sum, how thought and expression are enactments and doings that bring newness into being. So as non-representational, expression incites a new language. However, Brian Mazzei cautions us, quote, "It is important not to think of the creativity of expression as if it brought something into being from nothing. It always takes place in a cluttered world," end quote. And we see this a cluttered world as sensings, which we'll talk about more in a moment, doings, philosophy, memory, these performative accounts, and potential thought. We see all of this as in a state of becoming. We see this as the collective. We see this as the assemblage information. We see this as form taking. And he says, Mazzei goes on to say that this process of form taking, expression as form taking, is by nature relational. So Isabel Stengers, in writing about Whitehead's modes of thought, teaches us that expression is, quote, that which will make itself felt, that which in one way or another will have to be taken into account. And in taking expression into account, we sensed and wrote our way into thinking with theory, being swept up by unexpected becomings as the unthought made itself felt. So expression is not a thing and is not communication. Expression just moves in. Expression is felt in its emergence. Deleuze writes, quote, expression and relations are always incomplete, always in the midst of being formed, not a representation of something that is or was. So expression has this real sense of, again, the collective and relationality, but also this nowness, this presence, this emergence of what is happening right in front of us. Deleuze and Guattari also write, quote, expression must break forms. It encourages ruptures and new sproutings. These sproutings materialize for us as we were doing our plugging in. So again, it was this enactment. These expressions formed in the plugging in chapters, not in ways that were representational again, but as ontological. We created new worldings in that we see thinking with theory as claiming a territory that ruptures conventional humanistic forms of inquiry. Thinking with theory continues in its expression as others take up this technique and make it their own. So expression in thinking with theory functioned in a very particular way. It functioned as movement between and among texts that were not pre-decided by us as readers. The relations among all the texts were generated by sensings and attunements that we felt in the act of plugging in. That is, we did not intentionally apply Foucault's theory of power to the women's performative accounts. Rather, thresholds became sites of difference, potential and relational in-betweens. And we write more about that in our second edition. Expressions of plugging in emerged from the ways in which we attuned to the thought that was emerging. And this was enabled or enacted by reading intensively. And all of this is pre-conscious, not pre-decided. We sense the potential of the unthought before it was articulated. It was ahead of us, preceding us. So unleashing a becoming is not representing or capturing a subject, object, or form. It is not planning a strategy for analysis through a pre-given method. To unleash a becoming is to plug everything in, to stay in the middle of it all, and to continue to do what comes next, to attune how relational lines of thought respond to each other, and to keep thought on the move so that it continues elsewhere. The writings and doings of all of the chapters of Thinking with Theory are expressions of ontological becomings. If becoming produces nothing other than itself, then a plugging in technique as ontological can never be imitated, transferred, or replicated. Each doing of plugging in is not different from other doings. It is difference itself. Furthermore, in this ontology of expression in Thinking with Theory, what is real is the becoming itself. And if what is real is becoming, then inquiry itself can only ever be becoming as well. Inquiry in this state of becoming does not seek an affirmation of what is known. Because becoming is reality, any plugging in is always in a state of formation. It is always in a state of relation. So ontologically, there's always more expression to come, enabling things to happen. The writing sparked by plugging text into one another shows thought taking form, yet does not attempt to represent lives. So writing as a field of relation taking form expresses its tendencies to activate a worlding. These tendencies are becoming questions that arrive on the scene, the concepts that carry thought elsewhere, a spark of expression taking form. What is composed is a worlding of affective attunements and expressive tendencies that live on, not a representation of the world, but a worlding that exceeds the individuation of our own plugging in. That is, writing the threshold expresses thought to come, and these tendencies taking form toward new becomings are doings that can be reread and encountered. Thus, each plugging in, each expression is singular, and its potential, its tendencies, it activates new worldings and new multiplicities. It keeps thought in motion and allows a becoming in writing and language. These movements and techniques of plugging in and of worldings cannot be replicated or copied. Repetition produces new iterations, the and of ontological expression and emergence.